Okay, now we're talking about the controls. This is what we're going to do about it. We have to realize that we can't say, hey, we don't want to go ahead and do this because this is risky. We have to do it. We've got to put the controls in place. The availability of the mission comes first here. And that requires that we continue in the face of threats and vulnerabilities that are out there. Okay, so then what do we do? Do we go ahead and kill the threat? Do we go ahead and kill the archer? We say, okay, well, can we do this once or do we do this continually? And once is unlikely. That would be like we have a hardware device and it doesn't work very well and we buy a better hardware device and we never have that problem again. Well, that's fine. We don't have that problem, but this new hardware that we have out there eventually will become old, and so we'll have to do it again. So we have to build some process here. So let's think in terms of the false narratives here. First off, do we remove the vulnerability? Well, no. Do we build systems without vulnerabilities? Well, maybe. What we do is we reduce vulnerabilities. Now, in hardware, what we would do is we would actually physically replace the hardware. We don't do that often. A lot of times we have software out there and we just upgrade the version of it. Sometimes there are settings on the machines where we make a change to those settings and then that set of settings becomes the new version that we have out there that makes us safe from that particular attack that's out there. A lot of people would say, hey, well, wait a minute, let's just stop the threat. I don't know that you can stop the threat, but you could limit the ability of the threat by implementing some sort of preventive controls that are out there. Now, some examples of preventive controls would be like authentication, because if you would like to go ahead and do that to the system, you have to have an account on the system. Oh, I don't have an account. Okay, well, then you can't get in. Well, once you're on the system, are you allowed to go ahead and change the configurations or, download that information? Well, you're not authorized to do that. Okay, so since you're not authorized, you can't get in there. Or you download that information, but it's encrypted. Do you have the key to decrypt it? So in those cases, we'd like to implement preventive controls, and that would be perfection, but we really can't do that. A lot of times what we can do is we can recover after the threat has exploited the vulnerability. And in those cases, really what it is backup and restore. But remember, you had to back up right before the threat got a hold of you, and then you restore right afterward. But then also remember, if you restore and you're just restoring the same system, that threat can come right back in and attack that vulnerability. So you have to back up before it, kick that adversary off the system, restore the system, don't let anybody in, fix the system so it's not vulnerable to that thing, and then let people in. And then if the adversary comes in, they go, oh, I can't do that thing right there. So that's how we look at the controls. Now we need some inputs to the control process. We could do this before deployment by doing better design. And we can't do perfect design because remember, we create design here and now for what we know. As that gets deployed out into the environment, after that deployment, things change and the programmer can't program for the future. I mean, they don't have a crystal ball at that point. So we have to also address inputs after the deployment, and that's usually incident management. That means that we have to know that it happened. We have to have a good reporting system or a good dashboard that's out there and have a pre-planned process to actually address that. Now, we've got an understanding of the process, and we need to match the vulnerabilities and threats to the possible controls that are out there. But management's stepping in here for a moment in time. And management says, okay, look, we've got these functional policies, and you have to follow it in this way. You can't just go ahead and be a cowboy and go ahead and take care of it that way. And we have these compliance requirements, and you have to take care of them first before you do this other thing. And when you do this compliance, you have to use that tool instead of that tool because this is in our compliance shed and that one isn't, even though that one would be better. So now we've got this input to the process as we go along. One of the things that we do is technical threat modeling. In other words, we want to figure out where our threats and vulnerabilities possibly are. Why? Well, because we as cybersecurity people, we need insight into the failures, into the problems, into the threats and the vulnerabilities. So what we're doing is we're identifying those vulnerabilities and threats. Well, how do we do that? Well, we start off by decomposing or breaking apart that asset delivery protocol. We look at the hardware that it's sitting on, because remember that hardware is also sitting on top of that, sitting an operating system. And if we could attack the firmware from the firmware level and then reach up into the operating system, okay, well, we've got a vulnerability between the two of those. But not only do we have the operating system, we've got the utilities, we've got the network, and then ultimately we have the application that is processing the business right there. That's going to be some sort of client server application or a multi-tiered application that's out there. Now we identify the vulnerabilities and the threats, and we have to organize those threats and vulnerabilities in the different systems that are available to us. We could catalog the vulnerabilities, the threats, and the exploits by looking at these different versions of it right here. And that's what we're going to do in the next section. So here's our vulnerability management process. First, we start off with a scan. We could use internal tools. We could do a network scanner or we could do a host scanner. We could also use other tools like penetration testing, and this could be internal or external. That also might be like a red team that's actually attacking your environment. They're scanning it, but they're actually going through the process of using the tactics and the techniques and the processes of our adversaries, and they're revealing to us how they can take advantage of those vulnerabilities in our systems, how those threats can be realized in this process here, and then we look at that process and we break it apart. So once we've scanned and we know what's going on, then we make some sort of change. That could be through the patch management process. Now remember, patch management is looking at vulnerabilities in that specific system, that particular piece of software that's out there. This is software version updates. And if we do it for that one system, we've got to do it for all the different systems. So now we need some sort of automation in place that's going to help us with that. Now that's just software version updates. We also have security configuration management. It used to just be called configuration management. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's security configuration management. And that's like turning off or on some sort of setting inside of the machine that is making us vulnerable. In other words, remote viewing of the registry. We want to go ahead and turn that off in a Windows system. So we'll turn it off, and that's a registry setting of it itself and permissions on the registry itself to go ahead and edit that. Now what that's doing is that's reducing the total number of possible vulnerabilities by doing both of those activities. So we're moving toward being free of the threats and vulnerabilities for this moment in time. Remember, it's process. There's also the change control process, which is inside of our business, and that's pure business process. That could also be, as a subcomponent of it, is some sort of configuration management. And all it does is move our hardware and software from a known good state to a known good state. And we move from state to state. Well, the previous state wasn't a known good state. It was, hey, you know what? We don't have these configurations in place. This isn't working the way we want it to. We want to go ahead and make it better. But in the change management process, we're looking at the business as a whole so that we may slow down our rate of change in order to allow business to, deploy some sort of assets or to deliver some sort of product that we have within our organization to make money, so that money can then be spent on, us as employees, but also putting controls in place. Now, there's a set of standards that we have to pay attention to here. I will dig very deeply into these in a lot of other videos, but I wanted to talk about these organization systems that we have here, and we break those down into vulnerabilities and threats. On the vulnerability side of things, we have the National Vulnerability Database that has both scored and unscored vulnerabilities that are listed. These are particular instances in this database, but this database has everything in it. What does it have inside of it? Well, it has CVE IDs. These are common vulnerabilities and exposure identifiers. This is a database entry, and it looks at and defines and catalogs cybersecurity vulnerabilities. All these database entries together, the last time that I checked, there were 240, almost 241,000 vulnerabilities that were out there. The scanners that you use inside of your organization output reports based upon CVE identifiers. So that's why we look at that CVE system. Now, inside of that system, when we have scored and unscored CVE IDs, the CVSS is the scoring system itself. It's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It describes the severity of the flaws. The highest number that you can get there is 10. And oh my God, when there's a 10, everybody in every single shop out there is going, ah! Okay, but each vulnerability in the database should be scored. It has a score, but sometimes they don't get around to it. Now you can, with these scores, you can adjust this in your environment. The last piece in the vulnerability side of things is OVAL, which is the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language, which allows transfer of information across your security tools back and forth. So if one security tool knows about this vulnerability, another security tool can take that into account. Now, we also need to organize by the threats that are out there. There are a couple of different systems that are out there. The first is CAPAC, which is the Common Attack Patterns Enumeration and Classification. This describes how an adversary would get in from a classic standpoint. How would an adversary take advantage of a buffer overflow? Here are all the conditions that need to be put in place. Or we can go to the much newer system, which is ATT&CK that's out there. That's adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. Attack systems actually studies real attackers in a real environment. It's not in a laboratory somewhere. So they look at these advanced persistent threats that are out there and say, these are the things that they do, and they try and organize all these commonalities together. The most recent system out there is the EPSS, which is the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, which allows us to say, hey, we should take care of this first and help us with our prioritization as we're going through. What do we get for all of this? Well, why do we do this? To increase the speed and effectiveness of remediation, to put controls in place to protect ourselves. And that means that we've got to have a system for organizing and categorizing. We're going to use that systems that are relevant to each one of our business, because it may be that you like ATT&CK and she likes CAPAC. And some people say, okay, well, I look better at this from a CVE standpoint because we're a development organization. But what we're going to do is we're going to integrate all those systems and languages together inside of our risk process. Now, when you look at this after the fact, okay, remember, this is going to be bolted into a lot of the other discussions that we have on threats and vulnerabilities. So if you're confused in those and you go, hey, wait a minute, you didn't cover that, come on back here. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon.